So good morning and good afternoon to all. We're very pleased that you could join us today for this masterclass event that will be run by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, with participation from UNIDRA. My name is Nyagodhie Maina, an international law advisor with IISD, and with me is Priscilla Pereira, legal officer with the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, UNIDRA. So IISD is an award-winning independent think tank working to accelerate solutions for a stable climate, sustainable resource management, and fair economies. The Agricultural Trade and Investment team that will be presenting today provides high-quality advice to governments and parliamentarians to strengthen countries' food security and livelihoods and to improve the quality of public and private investment in agriculture and food systems, while protecting land rights and responsibly managing natural resources. We would love to know who is with us today, so please type in the chat, tell us who you are and where you're joining us from. And in case your bandwidth allows, please switch on your video, but mute yourselves until our Q&A. In the meantime, during the presentation, do not hesitate to type in your thoughts and questions in the chat box. Our masterclass today will focus on two new guidance documents that can help governments shape the legal structure of large-scale investments in agriculture to ensure that they are more responsible. The first part of the session will focus on joint venture agreements, a legal instrument that developing countries are beginning to explore to govern responsible investment in ag and food systems. In IISD's work with developing country governments, and more broadly, we are seeing a growing interest in the Africa region to use different business models, including JV agreements to structure large-scale private investments in agriculture. And with this growing interest, countries are keen to know more about the risk profiles, the potential benefits, and the strategies to address using such models. So in response to this, IISD has recently published a best practice bulletin on joint venture agreements, and this is the first in a forthcoming series designed to help government, policymakers, and agricultural investment negotiators understand the benefits, the limitations, the risks, and the policy issues raised by different legal tools used for investment in ag. In a similar vein, UNIDRA and IFAD have recently launched the Legal Guide on Agricultural Land Investment Contracts, also known as the ALEC Guide. And like IISD's best practice series, the ALEC Guide provides practical legal guidance for governments and other users on other legal form that an agricultural investment could take. Our presentation aims to look at the following. So first, we will look at what public-private joint ventures are and what we mean and how can we define them. Secondly, we'll look at the potential benefits of a joint venture, as well as the potential risks of this model when it comes to the agricultural sector. We will then pose some questions that governments and other policymakers need to consider in choosing to use a joint venture agreement. And then we'll look at the key issues to consider while drafting a joint venture agreement. We will then have a second segment where Priscilla will take us through the recently launched ALEC Guide that I just mentioned, what it is and how it can help address some of the challenges identified. We really hope that this masterclass will help government policymakers and all stakeholders involved in ag and food systems better understand the benefits, the limitations, and the legal risks and policy issues concerning this legal instrument. Firstly, it's important to clarify that while other types of joint ventures do exist, we are talking specifically about a type of joint venture that is called a public-private incorporated joint venture. So what is unique about this model? As defined by UNIDRA, this model is a public-private joint venture because it involves a collaboration between a public entity on the one hand and the investor that is a private company. And this is distinct from a joint venture between two private companies. It's an incorporated joint venture because it is carried out through a dedicated company that is established by the public and the private partner to set up and run the project. And here we'll refer to as a JV company. So the public sector body and the private sector contribute to a commercial venture and agree to develop and manage the business on a joint basis. In this arrangement, the public and private partners each contribute equity, they intend to share profits, and jointly manage the company. A key feature of this joint management is that both partners appoint board members to the board of their joint venture company, therefore both exercising control of the company. An incorporated joint venture is, however, quite distinct from a contractual joint venture in which no new company is created. And similarly, this varies from a community investor joint venture agreement where the two entities involved may include a cooperative that represents the community on the one hand and the private investor on the other. The JV model is quite common in the water sector, as we've seen, but not so much in agriculture. In fact, in a study of about 70 agri-PPPs that FAO conducted in 2016, they found that the JV model can only be used in exceptional cases. However, they also note that its use is likely to increase in the region, along with a growing focus on public-private partnerships. We can all agree today that more public investment and private investment, both foreign and domestic, is needed in the agricultural sector. Our research so far showed that when used in agriculture, investments channeled through the JV model were used predominantly in production technology and trade infrastructure. So for instance, joint ventures have been used in the Philippines for the development of an agricultural trade terminal, in Rwanda for irrigation and fertigation technology, and in Malawi for greenhouses, and in South Africa for research and training feed mill and laboratory. So this begs the question, why would governments choose a public-private joint venture model? And what do they think are some of the potential benefits? In general, joint venture agreements can be seen as a way of, firstly, combining the strengths of the private sector, so such as innovation, financial capacity, commercial, managerial, and operational expertise, and access to technology. For the public partner, it can be seen as a way of pursuing public interest objectives, creating an enabling policy environment, and knowledge of the local and national context. Secondly, a joint venture agreement can be seen as a way of creating an opportunity to transfer skills from the private partner to the public partner. It can also be seen as a way of giving access to the sources of market finance that a government credit rating may not allow. The public partner can also exercise oversight over day-to-day investment activities, or at least key decisions of the joint venture company, given the board oversight role, which I'll get into a little later. A joint venture can also be seen as a way of providing greater transparency for the financial performance of the agribusiness project. The public partner can also share in the profits of the joint venture company. And in the context of land-based investments in developing countries, JV models can be seen as or perceived to be more publicly acceptable and politically feasible, given the concerns and previous negative experiences with other investment agreements involving agricultural land. So we've seen this in instances of leases, concession agreements, or management contracts, where the investor usually receives a large tract of land for a long period of time with minimal monitoring. And this has led to a number of issues around rights, around underutilization, around affecting the environment. A JV is also seen to be preferable by local interests, as it's seen as keeping land in public hands, as compared to the long-term lease, for example, by way of the public partner to the JV. Lastly, it can also be seen as more attractive to a foreign investor who sees the structure as better for sharing risk in a potentially unfamiliar developing country context that may be seen as high risk. And we think this might be the reason why there's an increasing ask by governments on how to use the JV and what are the potential risks of the JV. In the next part of the session, Priscilla will go into more detail on how the UNIDRA IFAD guide might help address some of these specific concerns related to land. So we have just discussed why governments and foreign investors tend to use or are increasingly using the JV model. But it's also important to note that there's no guarantee that the JV model will deliver on the benefits mentioned, and there are several risks associated with it. This is not an exhaustive list. However, we do hope it will shed some light and lead to the right kinds of questions and considerations for governments when considering this model. So first is the issue around conflict of interest between the state and the private company. The JV model involves what the World Bank describes as an inbuilt conflict of interest. And at the heart of this conflict is the fact that the state and the private company each have fundamentally different objectives. So the state aims to maximize public welfare and the company seeks to maximize profit. So in this instance, should the public partner behave like a business partner or a government regulator? And for example, where there is a JV to produce fortified food products for publicly funded school programs, this makes the public partner in the JV both the business co-owner and the client at the same time. Secondly, is the risk of investors avoiding regulation and external scrutiny because they are in partnership with the government themselves. And this can manifest in different forms. In some instances, the investor would prefer a JV model, not necessarily because it's a strong business case for them or that it might be the best way to run the project, but rather as an insurance policy of some sort to manage its relationship with the government. So for example, the private partner may prefer a JV with a minority shareholding for the government. So the JV company can evade external scrutiny that would be directed toward a fully private company. In other instances, the investor may try to argue that the votes of government-appointed directors constitutes government approval, even where that director does not represent the relevant ministry or regulatory authority involved. Another risk we've identified with the JV model is that the public partner's representation on the board of the JV company may not result in real control and oversight of the company. And this can happen for a number of reasons. First, one is that the public partner may lack the capacity to effectively participate in the management of the company. So the government-appointed board members may not have the time or the expertise to engage with the issues discussed at board meetings, or they may not receive enough information with enough time to properly evaluate. They could also be cut out of the decision-making process. So the private partner can choose to make key decisions before board meetings rather than putting them on the agenda to discuss at the board level. And lastly, another risk that we see with the JV is that the JV company may fail to pay out the promised dividends, which may have been a compelling reason for the government to choose this model. In fact, with most of the requests that have come into us, this has been the most compelling reason for using the JV model, second to how to manage the land. And the risk with the issue around dividends is they may not be typically paid out of profit. They're typically paid out of profits, but there are several ways of the JV company to artificially reduce the profits to avoid paying dividends. The JV company can do this, for example, through self-dealing. And this is when two related companies trade with each other and artificially distort the price at which the trade is recorded. And this has the effect of inflating the costs and reducing the profits. And this can happen in particular where control of pricing information resides with the private parent. Self-dealing pricing often occurs through the provision of technical services, which can seem invisible. The JV company could also artificially reduce its profits by lending excess cash to affiliates elsewhere, paying large salaries to executive staff, to subcontractors, etc. Ultimately, a government considering using a JV should carefully think through whether this is the right structure for a given agribusiness project. Some key questions to consider to help governments conclude better JV agreements for agribusiness projects include: 1, what are the benefits that the public partner wants to get out of this project? And secondly, what are the risks that may prevent these benefits from actually being realized? And does a jointly owned and managed business offer the best structure for the management and mitigation of these risks and realization of these benefits? And lastly, what can a joint venture do better than the government alone or the investor under a more arm's length contractual arrangement in which the public sector transfers risk to the private sector, like a concession agreement? Having a defined list of priority projects and the preferred business models can be a way of ensuring that JVs are used only when it's in the government interest, not just because an investor has requested so. The fundamental question for a government is whether a JV is the right model for a given agribusiness project. And if the answer is yes, then the next step will be to draft a JV agreement. And here we mean the shareholders agreement in the case of a company formed, but for other corporate structures, it could have a different name. It also fundamentally dies down to the domestic legislation in the country. And these are some key questions that the government would need to answer when doing so. And it's by no means an exhaustive list, but aim to address the risks identified in this presentation and thinking through the issues carefully before arriving at the negotiation table that can help mitigate the risks outlined. The first one will be, how will the JV be funded? And this is quite a critical issue. What will be the initial and ongoing sources of funding for the project? Usually the government's initial equity contribution, so the money or other sources of capital like land, it contributes to the project will determine what level of shareholding it has in the company. So it's also important to decide what level of shareholding the government wants and what level of control the government wants to have. In some contexts, the public partner may not wish to be a majority shareholding in the JV company. This is due to the financial risk and burden on management that this may entail. However, some public partners prefer this to retain a majority share in the ownership of the JV to ensure that the company maintains its focus on creating public value. The government should also decide what its equity contributions will actually be. Land could be one option for the public partner. However, what about the other inputs that the government is bringing to the table? For instance, community relations, local knowledge. How will these elements be valued and by whom? It's also important to decide and map out whether the parties will be required to contribute further capital to the JV company, and if so, when and under what circumstances. This is an especially critical issue for low developing countries. Land is also one of the most important and contentious issues at the heart of any agricultural investment project, including one that uses a JV structure. So it's critical that the JV agreement clearly sets out how the land is to be dealt with over the lifetime of the project. For instance, what will be the consequence of the JV company failing to develop the land as promised? And under what circumstances can the public partner take the land back? Will the JV company also forfeit its performance bond if one has been paid at the outset of the investment? And Priscilla, I know we'll also go into some issues, pre-contractual steps that need to be taken with land-based investments. There are a number of other important questions that a government needs to think about and carefully negotiate in its JV's agreement. These can be quite technical, and there are too many to go into detail about today. But they're very important to the level of control and oversight that the government has over the project and the land that it has provided, as well as the benefits that the government gets from the contract. So I'll just list them out quickly. And the second one is, what level of control and oversight does the government want to have? What will the board appointments be and decision-making procedure? And should there also be a list of reserved matters or key decisions that only the partners can take? And what will be the process of issuing new shares? Thirdly, what is the exit strategy? So how can a party sell its interest and exit? Does the government intend to be in the investment project during the whole tenure of the investment cycle or to exit prematurely, and under what conditions? What breaches are material or so serious that they warrant terminating the contract? And what are the consequences of termination by either of the parties? So here we've listed also some key questions that the government would need to answer in determining, one, the desirability, and two, the practicality of using this model. First, of course, is what are the relative benefits and risks of JVs compared to other types of agricultural investment contracts? And two, the country needs, and the policymakers would need to ask, do you currently have a template contract for JVs? And what are the potential benefits of creating one, and what red line provisions would you include to ensure that all the risks identified have been mitigated and the benefits and goals that are intended will be achieved? So thank you very much for your attention. I will now hand over to Priscilla from UNIDRA, who will take us through the second segment of the presentation. I will also share our best practice bulletin in the chat box for anybody who would like further information on joint venture agreements.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Priscilla Andrade, Pereira de Andrade. So I have two last names. That's why Nyaguti said Pereira at the beginning. I am a legal officer here at UNIDRA, the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law. And I will be talking briefly presenting the ALEC guide, the Agricultural Land Investment Contracts Guide that was recently launched by UNIDRA and IFAD. So before I start explaining in more detail what this legal guide on agricultural land investment contracts consists of, I will briefly present what UNIDRA is and what's its mandate first. Briefly looking at the background, UNIDRA is an independent intergovernmental organization, which was founded in 1926 as an auxiliary organ of the League of the Nations. And afterwards, it was reestablished in 1940 on the basis of a multilateral treaty, so known as the UNIDROIT Statute. Its headquarters is in Rome, in Italy. And UNIDROIT currently has 63 member states, representing a variety of legal regions and a variety of political and economical systems, as well as different cultural backgrounds. The purpose of UNIDROIT is to prepare studies and evaluate the needs the needs and methods for modernizing and harmonizing and coordinating private law, and in particular commercial law between states and groups of states in order to formulate uniform law instruments, principles and rules to achieve those objectives of harmonization. So both legislative and non-legislative activities are undertaken by UNIDROIT, and over 80 studies have been prepared over the years, including international conventions, protocols, modal laws, principles, and also legal guides, as I will be presenting one of the legal guides elaborated today. And then you'll have to click on them. So to further exemplify the fields of work done by the International Institute for Unification of Private Law, at its website, you'll find more information, but these are the field of work that we have been adopting legal instruments in. So international commercial contracts, international financial devices, capital markets, protection of cultural property, transnational civil procedure, and also private law and agricultural development. These are just illustrative list of some of the instruments adopted, and several of the instruments, especially dealing with international commercial contracts and trade financing. For example, in particular, trade financing related to leasing and factoring are relevant for the area of agriculture production and investment. But we will be focusing here on private law and agricultural development. So the last part of this slide. And I will give you more details about the work done in the field of private law and agricultural development. And in particular, I will give you an overview of the ALEC legal guide. So this work in UNIDROIT's work in the field of private law and agricultural development started in 2009, when the governing council of UNIDROIT agreed that it had the private law expertise that the Institute has could contribute as well to the achievement of a number of sustainable development goals. So the work developed in the area of agricultural development is undertaken mainly in partnership with other Rome-based international organizations, such as the FAO and IFAD. The first guide developed within this partnership was the legal guide on contract farming. So you see the image of the legal guide on the left. It was adopted in 2015, and the agricultural land investment contracts, the ALEC guide, was the second guide developed within this partnership. So both guides lay out rules and rules to promote an enabling legal environment and identify best practices, especially in contractual arrangements. So the focus of these instruments is mainly to provide guidance on private contractual law, and for this purpose, for the guidance on private contractual law, both guides, the contract farming and the agricultural land investment contracts, build upon the UNIDROIT principles of international commercial contracts. So the focus for this masterclass is to talk a little bit about the ALEC guide. This ALEC guide was recently published and launched by IFAD and UNIDROIT. It does not endorse large-scale land sales and acquisitions on the opposite, it provides guidance on alternative business models for large-scale investment in land. The instrument aims at raising awareness about these alternative investment models to help ensure that when leases of agricultural land occur, they are done responsibly by respecting, for example, stakeholders' rights, particularly those rights of legitimate and not only legal tenure right holders, as well as by respecting social and environmental rights. So who is the target audience of this guide? It's the target audience are legal counsels involved in the preparation, negotiation, and implementation of agricultural land investment contracts, including legal professionals working for investors, host states, legitimate tenure right holders, local communities, for example. So what was the approach taken for the development of the guide? So the development of the guide within a working group from 2016 to 2020. So during 4 years, the guidance developed follow a very concrete approach based on contract law principles and practices, and actual investment operations were analyzed. So the instrument avoids duplicating existing international guidance and standards, and therefore the ALEC guide refers to a number of other international instruments, such as the ones developed by FAO, the CFSI, FGGT, and the CFSRI principles for responsible agricultural investment. The guide also refers a lot to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. What is the structure of the guide? The guide contains 7 chapters addressing important aspects of agricultural land investment contracts, and it follows the life cycle of the contractual arrangement. And at the end of the guide, after the 7 chapters, there's also a checklist of key issues that legal counsel or affected parties by the investment may consider looking at in order to check if they have included all the key issues for a responsible investment. So here, basically, I included the title of each chapter. The ALEC guide follows a similar structure to the first guide developed, the legal guide on contract farming, and it provides innovative legal guidance that operationalizes the international instruments I mentioned previously. So the VGGT, the CFSRI, and the UN UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So it basically takes soft law instruments and translate those instruments into legal technical language. Chapter 1 deals with the legal framework. So what it does, it outlines how to proceed with the evaluation of the applicable framework, including both domestic and international sources of law. It helps identify the gaps that may exist in that legal framework, and to analyze how the contract may fulfill those gaps. Then chapter 2 talks about the parties and the contractual arrangements that may be established. So it examines who are the potential contracting parties and who are the other stakeholders that may be affected or that should be involved in the agricultural land investment. So it talks about local communities, indigenous peoples, government agencies, service providers that may be involved within the contractual arrangement or affected by the contractual arrangements. So it also presents several types of contractual arrangements that may be adopted beyond the main contractual investment contract, land investment contract, sorry. So investor grantor contracts, multi-party contracts, community development agreements, etc. In this chapter 2, it is important to notice that there is a very interesting stakeholder mapping presentation. So it helps identify the potential investors and grantors and also the affected parties. Chapter 3 talks about the significant pre-contractual issues that may that have to be addressed in an agricultural land investment contract. So in view of the importance, for example, of obtaining essential information regarding the identity of the parties, the stakeholders related to the land investment before the signature of the contract, the third chapter of the guide presents key elements of the pre-contractual process regarding due diligence, feasibility studies, business plans, as well as impact assessment. And when we talk about impact assessment in chapter 3, we also talk about social, environmental, and also human rights impact assessment. So we give guidance on how to proceed due diligence and impact assessment. Chapter 4 is a very interesting chapter. It starts bringing in textual best practice guidance on the rights and obligations of the parties. So whether the ALEC is a single contract or a series of related contracts, it is important to set out provisions addressing not only the particular tenure and associated rights associated to the land, but it's also necessary to address and include in that contract social and environmental safeguards to address the gaps that we mentioned that have been identified in the legal framework. So the contract becomes a complementary tool to the legal and regulatory framework. Chapter 4 aims to assist with the negotiation of the provisions in various areas. So land tenure, human, social rights, including food security, gender and youth, finance, investment protection, and regulatory autonomy of the states. And it also brings information on how to conduct the monitoring and the implementation of that contract in order to ensure transparency throughout the investment life. Chapter 5 talks about how you manage the contractual relationship during that life cycle. So it deals with cases of non-performance, and it addresses the remedies that may exist in order to address those non-performance cases. So as leases of agricultural land usually involve long-term contractual relationships, it is important to understand, for example, the risks in a particular investment and promote cooperation between the parties and the stakeholders throughout the investment. So the legal guidance developed in Chapter 5 is to analyze possible excuses and remedies for non-performance cases. So for example, in case of COVID and something, just an example. So it addresses cases of force majeure and how, I won't have time to go into the contractual detail, but it gives contractual law input on how to address these cases of non-performance. Chapter 6 then talks about the transfer of rights and obligations. So when the land investment is about to finish, or if something went wrong, what do you do with the land? And so how do you return the land and the tenure rights, right? So it deals about taking care of the land also after the investment. And finally, Chapter 7, grievance mechanisms and dispute resolution. In cases of when non-performance cases and excuses are not able to be justified, then you have grievance mechanisms and dispute resolution mechanisms. So this chapter explains all the possibilities and alternatives that may be added to the contract to address these, to set out and to explain how you set out and implement grievance mechanisms for employees, legitimate tenure right holders, and local communities that may be affected by the investment. So in this last chapter, the legal guidance aims at assisting in understanding the dispute resolution possibilities, such as arbitration, accessing courts, and also alternative grievance mechanisms such as the national focal points of the OECD, for example. So this was basically a very, very brief overview of the guide. And as I mentioned, after these 7 chapters that have quite dense content, you have a checklist of issues that need to be addressed in order to fulfill a responsible land investment contract. So I would like to note also, to conclude, that the PDF of the guide is available for download for free on the UniDraw website, and I will add it to the chat after my presentation, and hard copies are available for purchase. So if you wish to learn more about the ALEC guide and also watch the video of the launch, everything is available on UniDraw's website and on UniDraw's YouTube channel. We are currently starting the 3rd project. I don't know if I mentioned previously. The project's title is Legal Structure of Agricultural Enterprises, and this project will be developed until 2023. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I would like to thank Nyaguti once again for this partnership and for inviting me to participate in this masterclass. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. I wonder if there are any questions from the participants. Please feel free to unmute yourself, and if your bandwidth allows, we'd also love to see you.
Hello.
Hello.
Guti, hi. I'm so sorry, I don't seem to be able to put my camera on, or rather, when I do, nothing appears. Thank you very much for the presentation. The point about transfer pricing in joint ventures in agriculture was raised in the context where often joint ventures take the form of business arrangements where there is both an operating company and there's also sometimes another joint venture or a lease agreement around access to the land. And so the key issue here is how companies that are party to a joint venture can determine pricing in such a way that profits are accumulated in one part of the enterprise so as not to share dividends with partners in another part of the joint venture. And this is what we see across the board. And it's one of the reasons why rural communities that give up their land hoping for development and dividends end up being paid often very low rental payments. And the companies in which there are joint venture partners never declare profits, but the downstream enterprises that do value adding and onward selling is where profits are accumulated. And this is because one company that is often a dominant party sells produce to itself. So if one reviews the actual financial benefits for rural communities that give up their land, in our case in South Africa, one of the big successful rural joint ventures, it's one of the biggest citrus companies in the Southern Hemisphere. The payment is equivalent to approximately a loaf of bread and a can of Coke per person per month in return for giving up their land. So, I think that the issue that I wanted to raise around transfer pricing is that it's very important to think about joint ventures as not merely about a business involving investors and the state. Normally, we're talking about an investor company that might be an operating company. There's also often either an upstream input supply company or a downstream processing or packing company. Normally, there is both a state entity or a traditional authority or some representative structure. Sometimes there is a community entity or even a workers' trust. And so the ways in which shares get allocated determines whether or not how risk and reward is shared, right? And so these are the classic conundrums. And of course, there is a big debate about whether business models can be made inclusive, and indeed whether or not control can be held by rural communities, or whether the nature of financial management and business management always means that they're excluded. And in this context, the key question, I suppose, is who are the brokers who claim to speak on behalf of the people who are giving up their land? And this is why often, in my view, joint venture agreements and the kinds of frameworks such as you've presented today are often seen as ways of allowing land grabbing to become ideologically and politically acceptable. This is what the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Olivier de Schutter, said, is that these codes for ethical land transactions often are about destroying the global peasantry responsibly. So I think that I just want to flag the politics around this, and also that the emphasis on states versus investors needs to be elaborated into an acceptance that states are not the same as the people on the ground, and that often the interests of states, even local government, are not the same as people who are directly affected, either in terms of land loss or other local impacts. But thank you very much. It was interesting to learn about these frameworks. We'll certainly look at them.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And yes, you've really made a good distinction between where the roles of the contracting parties are, between the state and the investor, and where also the community is involved. And the guidance it's obviously it's not something that is very black and white, and there's so many complications on the agreements that state out the rights and obligations regarding the community, and also where the state plays a part. But here we are trying to distinguish that it's the state who is a contracting party, as opposed to the community investor agreements where the government just comes in as a big brother. I know Dr. Vitska Chamberlain is looking at this issue in South Africa. Our paper unfortunately doesn't go into the details of the community investor, but we would love to have a look at the paper you've shared. And I also invite everybody to look at the paper that Ruth has shared, or report that Ruth has shared. You really have raised some important issues. And yes, joint venture agreements are really not a silver bullet in addressing the land question. I want to invite Tiali and also ask that if you do not speak French, to also just subscribe to the English channel.
Non, je parle français plutôt. Merci beaucoup. Hein. Bonjour, je me présente. Je m'appelle pas Tiali, hein. C'est mon adresse email que j'ai oublié de changer. C'est Madame Diop Ndeikoura Mbaye. Et je suis la coordinatrice d'un projet au Sénégal qui a travaillé sur le foncier, et c'est le projet de développement inclusif et durable de l'agribusiness au Sénégal, qui a travaillé sur des partenariats entre des investisseurs et les communautés d'intervention du projet. Et là, moi, c'est plus pour mon partage d'expérience, parce que dans mon projet, nous avons signé des accords. Nous sommes arrivés au stade de signature d'accords cadres et de cahiers de charges entre les investisseurs et les communautés. C'est des accords tripartites entre les communautés et les investisseurs. Mais malheureusement, dans la mise en œuvre, je ne suis pas encore arrivé au stade de règlement de conflit, ou au stade où il y a des problèmes de mise en œuvre de ces accords. En tout cas, le constat que j'ai, parce que ça fait 1 an qu'on a déjà eu la signature de ces accords, et il y a des cahiers de charges aussi, et il y a des investisseurs qui tardent à mettre en œuvre vraiment les engagements qu'ils avaient vis-à-vis des communautés. Ça traîne, parce que là, ça a été fait dans le cadre d'un projet. Quelquefois, on ne sait pas, hein, il y a des stratégies où on attend, par exemple, que le projet se termine pour que chacun se remette dans la situation où il était avant. Donc, dans ce cas où l'investisseur tarde à mettre en œuvre ses engagements, quelles sont les expériences qu'on a, hein? Comment est-ce qu'on peut traiter ça? Parce que là, l'investisseur est déjà installé et à la limite est même en train de mettre en œuvre son projet. Mais du côté des communautés, mis à part l'appui du projet sur certains aménagements, la partie qui était réservée à l'investisseur tarde à être mise en œuvre. Est-ce qu'il y a des expériences dans ce domaine? Autre chose, j'aimerais bien, vraiment, je tiens à, si possible, avoir le guide dont on parlait tout à l'heure pour avoir le lien pour pouvoir télécharger. Ça pourrait peut-être nous aider. Par contre, je voulais vraiment remercier. C'est ce que j'aurais dû faire plus tôt. C'est un thème qui est très intéressant et qu'on nous ait permis de pouvoir participer à cette session. Vraiment, merci beaucoup. S'il y a des expériences sur ce dont je viens de parler, vraiment, je serais très contente de partager. Voilà, merci.
Okay. No, I would just like to thank for the experience that she just shared. And in terms of how the ALEC addresses it, what is the feedback that you are precisely looking for? If you could, si vous pouvez répéter la question, je vous remercie.
And we do have 2 questions still on the floor, but I think Tiali did want to know how to address issues around dispute settlement with communities, and also the issue of the investor not having implemented the project, if there's ways that the ALEC guide can support countries in addressing this issue. And maybe I can suggest, as you are reflecting on his question, I can ask Giger and also Kwame to ask the questions, and then we'll try address in the 7 minutes remaining.
I will go ahead. It is a short question to Priscilla. First of all, thank you both for the excellent presentation. I learned a lot. Thanks a lot. The question is, what does your guide say about transparency? We know that many deals the contracts are not public, and do you give guidance on what a minimal level of transparency should mean? You know, for instance, the terms of the contract, how many taxes should be paid, the leases that are paid, all these things. Do you give some guidance on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Giger. And then Kwame, please have the floor.
Yeah. Hello, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Very good. I'm Kwame Tinedu, Vice President of the International Federation of Surveyors. I am grateful for those presentations, and first of all, I'd like to associate myself with what the comments from Ruth. Indeed, this is a scenario that runs across most West African nations, where agriculture is supposed to be a larger employment for opportunity for the youth and for entrepreneurs. However, if you find governments entering into very unfavorable contracts that seems to support the external investor more than taking care of the local populace, then there is an issue. Who speaks for the local populace? For instance, if you have leases for as little as $15 per acre for 50 years, $15 per acre for 50 years, and you have state institutions and sometimes governments being, the ones entering this kind of contracts. What role can communities play besides the NGOs, making the noises? What action can, apart from unconscionability clauses that are provided, what actions do you think local societies and communities can play in making sure they get a fair deal if their lands are appropriated from them? Thank you very much. And I've learned quite a lot from the ALEC presentation. I'm most grateful for that.
Okay, okay. No, thank you very much for the questions and especially for the interest in this second guide that we have developed with IFAD. So the large scale investments is we all know is a very problematic type of investment, and we know we had a lot of land grabbing issues in the past, and we still continue having a lot of land grabbing issues currently. So the ALEC guide does not, as I said, does not promote sales of lands in these leases when they occur in long term. There are some guidance on how to keep the monitoring, and this replies also the question posed by Giger Marcus. So very interesting question related to the transparency, and that takes me to reporting obligations, right? So the transparency goes along with the reporting requirements, and this really depends on the domestic legislations, I would say. So the contract complements the regulatory framework and what you see currently is a movement of several developed countries adopting, for example, supply chain due diligence requirements from the larger companies, right? So this is a type of the reporting obligation. What I want to say is it may come from the domestic law, legal framework where the land is situated, but it may also come from extraterritorial domestic laws that regulate the activities, the business of these large investors, right? So the transparency will go along with the reporting requirements, but we do address this and we do give guidance on transparency and in reporting obligations, not only financial reporting, but also non-financial reporting as a best practice in Chapter 4. So you have several paragraphs giving guidance on that in order to obtain more transparency, because we all know that these arrangements are not transparent from the beginning. But there's a movement going on in several fronts, not only on domestic legislations, but also bilateral investment treaties that have been adapted in order to include, for example, corporate social responsibility requirements within the treaty. So when an investment contract or investment contract is established between a government and an investor, they normally have to fulfill those requirements that are also established by the treaty. So you have several legal frameworks to consider. But I invite you to look at Chapter 4 on the reporting requirements and transparency. I don't know if that covers a little bit of everything, and I'm happy to leave my email also in the chat if you have further questions.
Thank you, Priscilla. I think that the session is about to end. But as Priscilla said, we'll put our emails in the chat, and please feel free to ask us any follow-up questions related to the presentation, or if you would like the presentation as well, we are happy to share it on email. I want to ask one last thing. If we could please just put on our video so we may take a quick picture just to remember today. But I just wanted to thank you all for your attendance during our masterclass, and we hope to stay in touch with everybody who's been able to attend it. If anyone else is able to put in their video chats, so I can take a quick picture.